able to welcome you all here tonight, the launch of issue 39.4. In particular, I'm pleased to extend a warm welcome to the Honourable Justice Brian Preston, to the Senior Commissioner Rosemary Martin of the Land and Environment Court, the partners and solicitors of King & Wood Mallesons, the Journal's faculty advisors, Associate Professor Lyria Bennett-Moses and Professor Rosalind Dixon, some of our contributing authors for the issue who are here with us tonight as well, Professor Jane McAdam, Professor Bronwyn Morgan and Declan Cush. And also welcome to the editorial board of the UNSW Law Journal. Tonight's launch marks the fourth and final issue of volume 39 and caps what has been an especially busy and productive year for the journal. We're very proud of our work and the history of the journal as a leading academic law journal. None of this, of course, would be possible without the generous assistance of a great number of people, some of which I would like to acknowledge now. On behalf of the journal, I would like to thank our host for tonight and premier sponsor, King & Wood Mallesons. Mallesons are one of our oldest continuing sponsors of the journal, and their support continues to be invaluable to the work that we do. So thank you very much to Kelly and her team at King & Wood Mallesons for assisting us in organising tonight's event. I would also like to thank our other premier sponsors, Allens and Herbert Smith Freehills, for their continuing support. Just as well I've got a loud voice. As a student-run journal, we are indebted to the Dean of UNSW Law, Professor George William, and our faculty advisors for their assistance and their enthusiastic belief in the journal and the students that volunteer their time to work on the editorial board. Our editorial board is, without a doubt, a very special group of people. Every single one of the articles in the journal that you now have before you has been edited multiple times with real diligence and real dedication. Without a doubt, we are incredibly proud of our editorial board. We are also very proud of our journal alumni, some of which are with us here tonight. Every year there is a changing of the guard in the editorial board as students graduate and move on to bigger and better things. This year, however, the journal will actually be losing several long-term board members, including some former issue editors, some that have been with the journal for 4 years. I know I speak on behalf of the board when I say thank you. Thank you for your contribution to the journal. Our alumni have gone on to achieve outstanding success within the legal profession, and I have no doubt that you are all on your way to join those ranks. I hope you will continue to remain connected with the journal in your future careers. Finally, I want to congratulate the editor of issue 39.4, Andrew Roberts. I was lucky enough to be elected to the journal executive at the same time as Andrew, so I've had the privilege to be inspired by his passion and commitment that he's devoted to realising the issue that we are launching here tonight. It's the culmination of many hours of hard work, made all the more impressive by the role that Andrew has played in the development of the journal's strategic plan. I mentioned a little earlier that it's been a very busy year for the journal. Andrew's been largely responsible for that, so thank you, Andrew. But seriously, Andrew has an incredible capacity for vision and planning, and there are a number of exciting developments coming up next year for the journal that have largely had the groundwork laid this year, and Andrew's played a very significant role in doing that. One of those developments I'm thrilled to be able to announce tonight for the first time, and that's the UNSW Law Journal Forum. This will be a new online publication for shorter form content that will complement our existing law journal. This will be a first for Australia in academic legal publication and will continue the reputation of the UNSW Law Journal as an innovative and leading law journal in Australia. So congratulations, Andrew. It's a great achievement and it's been a real privilege working with you. Lastly, I would like to introduce Vishal Ahuja to speak on behalf of King & Wood Mallesons. Vishal is a partner with the firm who specialises in advisory and transactional work relating to energy and utilities, infrastructure access, competition law, major projects, and most importantly for tonight, climate change. So thank you very much for your time. We're very grateful to have you speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I noticed that Justin used his iPhone. I have paper. Can I also say what a pleasure it was to get a journal in hard copy and to actually be able to do that with everything that the library sends me these days is electronic and I have to peer at it. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure on behalf of Kingwood Mallesons to welcome you here tonight for the launch of the latest edition of the UNSW Law Journal. Kingwood Mallesons has a long association with the UNSW Law School, not least of which is we take a number of your graduates. We have summer clerks starting here this week, and I know that we have quite a few of your students. But in particular, as Justin mentioned, we have had a long association with the Law Journal. We've been a premier sponsor for 35 years, so longer than I've been alive. Oh, you weren't supposed to laugh at that, I hope. Anyway. Our sponsorship of the journal really reflects our commitment to legal excellence and also thought-provoking analysis. And having looked at the articles in the journal, it's clear the effort and the commitment that's gone into those journals. The theme of the journal, the issue of this issue, rethinking climate change and the law, I think is very timely. And I think particularly stressing the rethinking. Kingwood Mallesons has long had a sustainability practice. When I started 20 years ago, it was building coal-fired power stations and coal mines. Sorry, that wasn't part of our sustainability practice. I'm saying that things have changed. And we've certainly been through the Kyoto protocols and projects and the trading, then through carbon introduction, carbon repeal, RED introduction, RED stall, and now we're in this phase of renewable projects again, and solar and batteries, solar products, distributed energy, and I think interestingly now also dealing with the impacts of climate change, so class actions on bushfires, floods, coastal erosion. So the nature of the practice really has changed, but I do feel that we are entering into a new phase. 2016 is, last week was announced as likely to be the hottest year on record, so that the problem is not going away. We've had the election of the Trump administration, and I'm going to play this very neutrally, but it does bring into question perhaps whether the ratification by the US of the Paris Agreement. So it feels to me that internationalism is slightly in retreat here, that getting these big bang solutions like carbon trading or a new RET is quite difficult. So we have to attack this problem in a multifaceted way, both big and small. What I found particularly valuable out of the journal was the different perspectives or the new perspectives as an approach and the role of law. So it looked at in terms of the way understanding the limitations of what we have, but also new ways of approaching this and new potential solutions in the toolkit. So for me, it certainly made me rethink the issue. And with that, I am again very proud to host this event tonight for the launch of this journal. And with that, I will hand over to Andrew Roberts.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very pleased to finally be welcoming you to the launch of issue 39.4 of the UNSW Law Journal. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we meet tonight, and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people with us this evening. Each issue of the UNSW Law Journal contains two distinct parts, a general component and a thematic component. The general component contains articles on all areas of law, but they are invariably diverse, original, and innovative. The 5 articles in the general component of this issue are certainly no exception. These articles include a unique statistical topic modelling of High Court judgments since 1903, an empirical study of family report writing practices in the family law system, an analysis of the potential director's fiduciary duty of disclosure, an historical account of the regulation of impaired doctors in Victoria, and an illuminating and entertaining article on the origins of Section 96 of the Constitution. The thematic component of this issue is on the topic, as has been mentioned, rethinking climate change and the law. And what an interesting time it is to be rethinking climate change and the law. In this month alone, we've seen the Paris Climate Agreement come into effect, and Australia agree to ratify it. In the same month that we've seen, and I'll be a little less even-handed on this, we've seen the election in the United States of somebody who thinks the concept of climate change was invented by the Chinese to undermine US trade. And in fact, just yesterday, the 21st of November 2016, we saw the Australian Senate spend an hour of its time debating, quote, the disputed theory of climate change. Just yesterday. So it's with a combination of optimism and trepidation that we're launching this issue tonight. This isn't the first time the UNSW Law Journal has addressed the topic of climate change. In fact, in 2008, we published a thematic called Climate Change Law in Australia. And I think it's fair to say that was a time of much greater optimism in climate politics in this country. In fact, that issue was, of course, published not all that long after then Leader of the Opposition, Kevin Rudd's now famous speech, where he called climate change the great moral challenge of our generation, and that helped him win an election. Since then, Australia has gone from leading the way on climate change to being one of the few countries who are taking backwards steps, from the repeal of the carbon tax, the watering down of renewable energy targets, the continued approval of major mining projects, and Australia's paltry targets under the Paris Agreement. Climate change has, to be honest, become a dirty word in Australia at the same time as we've begun to feel the effects in new and much more pressing ways. Climate change is a truly systemic problem that will impact every aspect of human life. And it'll impact it in profound ways. It's going to affect biodiversity and food security, health outcomes, poverty rates, will lead to displacement. It's going to affect the economy, and it may even lead to serious armed conflict. The effort to address climate change must respond to this complexity and its inherently interdisciplinary nature. The goal of this thematic is to rethink the intersection between climate change and the law, and to consider the role of the law in implementing these solutions. The 8 articles in the thematic component capture the complexity of this challenge. They cover the Paris Agreement, and particularly its implications for developing nations. They cover the displacement of people as a result of climate change and international movement in that space. They cover transitioning the stationary electricity market to renewable energies, which is, of course, particularly relevant considering the criticism levelled at that just months ago in South Australia. They address a proposed framework for integrating blue carbon into Australia's climate policy, the interaction between climate change and planning law, the case for resilience thinking in Australian conservation law, the legality of fossil fuel divestment, and the socio-legal impacts of the emerging politics of climate change. And what's important is that these articles don't just provide incisive analysis of the problems, which they do, but importantly, all of them also consider pragmatic pathways for reform. I truly hope that this issue can help to inform a national debate that has the capacity to transcend the polarising politics of climate change in Australia. I believe that the articles in this thematic can help us to plot a path forward on what I do believe is indeed our greatest moral challenge. Each issue of the UNSW Law Journal is the combined effort of a great many people, of whom I am incredibly grateful, and I would like to thank a few of them now. I'd like to thank Dr. Declan Cush and Mr. Costa Agvestinos for their invaluable assistance in framing this topic many, many months ago. Thank you also, of course, to our wonderful faculty advisors, Professor Rosalind Dixon and Associate Professor Lyria Bennett-Moses, as well as the Dean of UNSW Law, Professor George Williams. I thank them for the generosity of their time and their mentorship over this rather arduous 14-month period, as well as their faith in us, all as student editors. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Associate Professor Michael Handler, who finished in his role as faculty advisor earlier this year, but not before imparting on me some of his carefully considered wisdom. I'd particularly like to thank, of course, all the authors for the issue, some of whom are here tonight, for entrusting us with their work. I've greatly appreciated their assistance in good humour, throughout the editing process, and it's been an absolute pleasure working with all of them. I would also like to thank the anonymous peer reviewers. Peer reviewing is a time-consuming but often incredibly thankless task, and I have great respect for the willingness of the academic community to dedicate their time and skill to reviewing articles for journals like us. The work that they do is absolutely essential for a journal like ours, and it should be recognised as a generous contribution to the academic community. I'm grateful, of course, to Meredith Barnes, who supplied the incredible artwork for the issue, which is for the thematic component. And of course, none of this would be possible without the hard work and dedication of the journal's editorial board. The student editorial board of the journal is really an incredibly capable, formidable, and indeed ridiculously pedantic group of students who volunteer a great deal of their time in their incredibly busy schedules to ensure every I is dotted and every T is crossed. And I actually think it's also worth noting that at 1,740 pages, Volume 94 is by far the longest volume we've had to date. So I'd like to particularly thank you all for your hard work this year. Thank you also to my colleagues on the executive committee who work together tirelessly behind the scenes managing the journal and producing each issue. I'm particularly excited by the plans that Justin mentioned for the journal next year, and I wish all of the incoming executive and continuing executive the best in implementing them. It's been an incredibly enjoyable and rewarding 2 years as part of the journal community, and it's been an honour to work with and get to know you all. Finally, on a personal note, I'd like to thank my parents who've always supported me, and of course my partner Amy, who stood by me through all the highs and lows of this issue, and now coming towards the end of 3 years of law school with an unbounded level of patience, care and kindness. And it's now with great pleasure that I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker this evening, the Honourable Justice Brian Preston. Justice Preston is the Chief Judge of the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, and before being appointed to the bench, Justice Preston was the inaugural Principal Solicitor of the Environmental Defender's Office and a leading barrister in the land and environment jurisdiction. His honour lectures in environmental law, is an editor of the Environmental and Planning Law Journal, and publishes widely in environmental issues including climate change. We're honoured to have had Justice Preston write the foreword to the issue, and are pleased to welcome his honour to deliver the keynote address. Please welcome Justice Brian Preston.
So I'll start with the topic of the real and present danger of climate change. In May 2016, the level of carbon dioxide measured at Cape Grim on Tasmania's northwest coast, aptly named, exceeded 400 parts per million for the first time. Cape Grim is one of only 3 World Meteorological Organization global superstations for the measurement of greenhouse gases. Now, this trend has continued. Carbon dioxide levels in August this year averaged 401.42 parts per million. That 400 parts per million threshold was first recorded to have been exceeded at another of the WMO global superstations at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii in 2013. When that occurred, NASA climatologist Dr. Gavin Schmidt observed that we are a society that has inadvertently chosen the double black diamond run without having to learned to ski first. It will be a bumpy ride. Now, as a keen skier, I like choosing the double black diamond runs, but with no snow, it's not so much fun. This year at Mauna Loa Observatory, the mean weekly concentrations of carbon dioxide as of 23rd of October 2016, only a month ago, was 402.27 parts per million. And the May 2016 value was 407.7 parts per million, which was the highest monthly value ever recorded. So these measurements at 2 of the 3 stations this year make it almost certain that the global annual average carbon dioxide level will exceed 400 parts per million for 2016. Now this is, just to put into some perspective, a 44% increase from the concentration of 278 parts per million around the year 1750. I know it seems a while ago, but it's come up a lot. And likely it's going to be the highest level that we have had in the past 2 million years. Now, this large and rapid increase in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases since 1750 is having significant consequences for the planet. As was mentioned a moment ago, 2015 was the warmest year on record for the globe since reliable global surface air temperature records began in 1880. But the last 15 years are among the 16 warmest years on record. But more is to come. 2016 is very likely to be the world's hottest year on record. The global temperatures for January to September this year have been 0.88 degrees Celsius above the average for the 1961 to the 1990 reference period, and approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius above the temperatures of the pre-industrial period. It's a little unevenly distributed, but just give me some idea. More than 90% of the northern hemisphere land areas north of the tropics were at least 1 degree Celsius above average. Parts of Arctic Russia were 6 to 7 degrees above the average, while other Arctic and subarctic regions in Russia, Alaska and northwest Canada were at least 3 degrees Celsius above the average. In the southern hemisphere, many areas were 1 degree or more above average, including northern South America, northern and eastern Australia, and much of southern Africa. Now, this warming is significantly affecting the oceans. The globally averaged ocean temperature and heat content are increasing, and the warming extends to at least 2,000 metres, 2 kilometres below the surface. Temperatures were above average over most ocean areas and were 1 degree Celsius or more above average in many parts of the tropical East and Central Pacific, the Eastern Tropical Indian Ocean and the Indonesian archipelago, the Tasman Sea, the West Subtropical North Atlantic, and the far North Pacific. Now, the very warm ocean temperatures contributed to significant coral bleaching in some tropical waters. One of the most significantly affected areas was the Great Barrier Reef, where record high temperatures occurred in March 2016. Coral mortality of up to 50% was reported in the northern parts of the Great Barrier Reef north of Lizard Island. Globally, the average sea level has risen over 20 centimetres since the late 19th century. Get your ruler out, think about 2/3 of your ruler, it's gone up. And about 1/3 of this rise is due to ocean warming and the rest from melting land ice and changes in the amount of water stored on the land. But global sea levels rose very strongly during this 2015 to 2016 El Nino event, rising about 15 millimetres between November 2014 and February 2015, which is well above the post-1993 trend of 3 to 3.5 millimetres per year. And the early 2016 values reached new record highs. So coming to Australia, the consequences of the increase in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases include at least the following. First, the mean surface air temperature and the surrounding sea surface temperature have increased by about 1 degree since 1910. The duration, frequency and intensity of extreme heat events have increased across large parts of Australia. There has been an increase in fire weather and a longer fire season, across large parts of Australia since the 1970s. Rainfall patterns have changed significantly, including, first, a reduction in the May to July rainfall by around 19% since 1970 in the southwest of Australia, a decline in the April to October growing season rainfall by around 11% since the mid-1970s in southeast Australia, and conversely, an increase in rainfall since the 1970s in northern Australia. Comparatively, however, Australia is less at risk from climate change than other countries in Asia and Africa. The Global Climate Risk Index 2017 measures the level of exposure and vulnerability of countries to extreme events. The 10 countries most affected by extreme weather events include 6 in the Asian region, being Myanmar, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam and Thailand. Now, poor countries in general are more exposed to climate change-boosted extreme events. There is unfairness in the distribution of these events. The least developed countries have contributed only a small fraction of the greenhouse gases warming the planet, yet they suffer much more from extreme weather that has been made more intense and frequent due to the greenhouse gases emitted by developed countries. So when we look at climate change, we can term it a wicked problem. Indeed, some term it as a super wicked problem. So what's a wicked problem? Well, wicked problems involve a combination of high levels of complexity, uncertainty, and value divergence. Climate change exhibits all of these features. It involves polycentricity, that is, a series of linked problems, none of which can be resolved in isolation. There are interdependencies in the environmental systems and between the causes and consequences of climate change. There are uncertainties in the knowledge base, including the extent of climate change and the causes and consequences of climate change. There is uncertainty in relation to the risks and consequences of both action and inaction. There is divergence in views as to the need for and the extent of change in law, governance, and behaviour to address climate change and its consequences, and the allocation of responsibility for any such change. There's divergence in views about values and equity issues, including the equitable sharing of burdens and benefits. There's divergence in views as to the choice of solutions to climate change. These and other issues of complexity, uncertainty, and divergence combine to make climate change a wicked problem. Now, solving wicked problems, as the name might suggest, is inherently difficult. 3 commonly recommended approaches are better knowledge, better consultation, and better use of third-party partners. There is a need to improve significantly the knowledge of both the wicked problem of climate change, its causes and consequences, and its possible solutions. Better consultation and collaboration with stakeholders is necessary to develop effective, efficient, and equitable solutions to climate change and its consequences. Such collaboration may involve reliance on non-governmental stakeholders, including the private sector and community organisations. The challenge posed by climate change is to develop new thinking about the multiple causes of problems, opening up new insights about the multiple pathways and levels required for better solutions, and gaining broad stakeholder acceptance of shared strategies and processes. Now, this special thematic issue of the University of New South Wales Law Journal on rethinking climate change and the law addresses this challenge. The various articles that you have to read examine from diverse perspectives the problem of climate change and the adequacy of the law in solving it. The diversity of perspectives represented in the articles is illustrative of the complexity and multifaceted nature of the problem and the solutions to it. An overview of this diversity of coverage can be provided by grouping the discussion into two categories: the problem and the solution. So the first is understanding the nature of the problem of climate change. Now, climate change is a problem that crosses boundaries of knowledge disciplines. It's a scientific, economic, social, environmental, and legal problem, to name but a few of the knowledge disciplines. It is also a normative problem, involving conflicts in values and what is equitable. Understanding this transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary nature of the problem is important if effective, efficient, and equitable solutions are to be found. Too narrow a conception of the problem confines the solutions. For instance, characterizing climate change as simply a scientific problem leads to devising scientific solutions alone. These scientific solutions will neither be effective nor efficient in addressing the multiple causes of the problem, nor will they be accepted by all stakeholders as equitable. Climate change is clearly a problem of the past. The climate change-induced events suffered today are a product of past behaviour. But climate change is also a problem of the future. Climate change does not readily fall within any pre-existing category of harm that's recognised by law. The future harm will be dispersed across the globe, affecting all people, but some people with particular severity. Although there's a reasonable certainty that there will be future harm, the precise nature, extent, and incidence of the future harm is uncertain. There's an urgent need to examine how well the law, in all its areas, is equipped to respond to this certain future harm, but uncertain incidence and extent of harm. Climate change poses other challenges for the law. It's a product of multiple actors, some making large contributions, the so-called major emitters, but most making small contributions to climate change. How is responsibility for past and future harm to be allocated? Climate change is also a product of slow onset processes rather than discrete actions or events causing acute symptoms. Climate change is the sum of innumerable small actions, each seemingly insignificant, but collectively and cumulatively significantly contributing to climate change. These and other diverse facets of the climate change problem need to be better understood. So let's turn now to finding the solutions to the climate change. Albert Einstein is often attributed, but indeed might have been misattributed, with saying that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. Well, nation states' past responses, or in some cases lack of responses, to climate change involve an element of insanity. The same things have been and continue to be done, but expecting different results. Instead, there's an urgent need to do different things. For the law, this involves thinking creatively and laterally, across different areas of law and different jurisdictions. Now, law is a form of social ordering, and it creates forms of organisation. There's a need to better understand these forms of ordering and organisation, to question assumptions as to the law and its role and application, and to devise creative and innovative solutions and reforms. One type of reform is to evolve from top-down to bottom-up solutions. Now, this type of reform is being evidenced in three ways. First, in international action to address climate change, the Paris Agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has moved from top-down imposed targets to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions to bottom-up nationally determined contributions. Warinki Singh and Dubler and McAdam discuss this bottom-up approach of the Paris Agreement in their articles. Second, there is an increasing recognition of the need for bottom-up action by communities to complement the top-down action by government. This is facilitated by giving respect and recognition to individuals, groups and communities, thereby promoting environmental justice. Lack of recognition inflicts damage. It constrains individuals, groups and communities, and it leads to ineffective participation in the polity, that is procedural injustice, and to inequalities in distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, distributive injustice. Giving respect and recognition to individuals, groups and communities encourages a plurality of viewpoints and values, which is necessary for developing solutions to the wicked problem of climate change. Participation in the polity should not be screened so as to allow only those people or those viewpoints and values which are predetermined to be acceptable or which fit within preconceived frameworks of law and governance. The benefits of broadening and making more meaningful and effective public participation is advocated by a number of the contributors to this special issue, include Manifold and Jessup, MacDonald, McCormick and Foster, and Morgan and Cush. McAdam explains how the Nansen Initiative on disaster-induced cross-border displacement, by listening to a wide range of views and not imposing a preconceived framework, conceptualised a comprehensive approach to displacement in the context of climate change and disasters. The manner and extent of participation of individuals, groups and communities in environmental decision-making needs to be meaningful. The level of participation is linked to the level of potential influence on the decision or action being considered. The community can also participate in institutions and institution building to promote the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. These institutions can be public regulatory institutions, but increasingly are private enterprises. Community engagement with these private enterprises may be by shareholder actions, such as bringing shareholder resolutions for climate change transparency to ensure that corporations adequately report on their contribution to climate change and the risks that climate change poses to corporate assets, such as the stranding of fossil fuel reserves. Also for divestment of activities and assets that contribute unacceptably to climate change, such as coal mining, or for greater corporate social responsibility generally. The community may also seek to influence corporate behaviour by divestment campaigns, urging investors to divest from corporations that contribute unacceptably to climate change, such as fossil fuel industries. Richardson assesses the legality of fossil fuel divesting by trust funds and public financial institutions and how fossil fuel divesting might be legally advanced. The community may also build its own enterprises, such as the example given by Morgan and Cush of a community energy enterprise to supply renewable energy to the community. The community may engage in adaptive co-management of projects between the government, project proponents and communities, each party being recognised for their knowledge and capacity to build climate resilience, as Manifold and Jessup argue. The community can provide public oversight of projects including monitoring the performance and enforcing compliance, a point made by MacDonald, McCormick and Foster. The community thereby promotes good governance. And my third way of encouraging bottom-up regulation is for bottom-up regulation by the environment rather than top-down regulation of the environment. The needs of the environment should drive the law and governance systems for tackling climate change. This ecocentric approach manifests itself in various ways. It involves full implementation of the integration principle, one of the principles of ecologically sustainable development. This principle ensures the effective integration of environmental, including climate change, considerations into social and economic development decisions. Morgan and Kusch advocate the need to weave social and ecological values into the heart of exchange and thus to address environmental law goals from the inside out. There needs to be environmental remediation of law and governance systems. An ecocentric approach assists in overcoming the problem of the transcendence of place. The preference of lawmakers for generalization, abstraction, and universalization of law detaches the law from the place. Environmental law is about the environment and its components as general concepts, but not about any specific place, thing, or person in the environment. Morgan and Kusch argue that there is a need to invest in place-sensitive, localised conceptions of legal strategies and for reimagining legal interventions and regulatory frameworks along lines crafted by the contours of local place and the vernacular dialects of social space. An ecocentric approach would recognise that ecological systems evolve and adapt and trigger the need for developing adaptive law and governance systems. Responding to climate change demands flexibility and adaptability. Systems that are able to adapt are resilient. MacDonald, McCormick and Foster call for reform of conservation laws to promote resilience to climate change. Bell James focuses on the carbon storage capacity of coastal systems and suggests ways in which blue carbon can be integrated into the existing legal and policy frameworks. Callies identifies the lack of flexibility and adaptability in the market and legal frameworks for the stationary electricity sector as a barrier to dealing with climate change. Not only is the current market framework perpetuating carbon-intensive patterns of electricity generation, but its legal frameworks are designed and embedded in a way that makes change cumbersome and difficult to achieve. There is a need to reform not just the patent architecture of laws regulating climate change and its consequences, but also the underpinning foundations of the laws and the legal systems. For example, principles of the rule of law, legality, and separation of powers are constitutional bedrocks of the legal system, and any action in relation to climate change will be judged against them. There are also the underpinning values that form the normative framework of the legal and governance systems. As I've noted earlier, Morgan and Kusch argue that there is a need to weave social and ecological values into the heart of the legal system, not to bolt them on as an afterthought, such as being done with carbon offsets. And finally, reform is usefully directed towards the governance systems. Good governance includes having good laws, but also good implementation and enforcement of these laws. My earlier comments are relevant to these aspects of good governance. But there is also the need to conceive of new forms of governance, including polycentric governance models, commons-based conceptions of governance, or cooperative public-private arrangements that break down the deeply ingrained ideas of the separation of the market as the private domain and climate policy as the public domain. So this special issue of the University of New South Wales Law Journal provides insights and critical analysis of the complexity, the uncertainty, and the value divergence of the problem of climate change, and proposes diverse viewpoints on solutions, particularly relating to legal and governance systems. The articles make a valuable contribution to the ongoing conversation about climate change, and I officially launch it.
Well, it's absolutely delightful to be here. I'm here as a faculty advisor along with my colleague Lyria Bennett-Moses, but more importantly on behalf of our Dean, George Williams, who's currently somewhere en route from Hong Kong to Sydney and sends his very sincere regrets that he can't be here this evening. First of all, Mr. Justice Preston, thank you for those really interesting and very wonderful framing remarks for the journal. I think if President-elect Trump were here and listening to you and the science and the compelling evidence that you present, some of the debates that we are now having, and as Andrew mentions in the Australian Senate, simply would not be possible. So for the science that you marshal and for the wonderful framing of the problem as the wicked problem that we know it is, you've given us a great way of thinking about the significance of this special volume. I also think the way you group the articles into deepening our knowledge of the problem and thinking about solutions is particularly helpful. Obviously, the articles are so diverse, and yet when we put them together and see this pattern of bottom-up, top-down, and the ways in which we engage in these pieces, the challenge of not just marshalling law, but thinking about an ecological approach, a technological approach, about finance and how divestment can play a role, and venturing into the world of science. You see the richness of the special edition, the thematic that Andrew and his team has put together. I think the place you ended as well, Judge, in terms of thinking about a value-infused rule of law is a particularly interesting and wonderful one. I'm currently working on a project on Australian constitutional values that people think is particularly heretical, but now we have an ecological rule of law to add to that list. So I thank you for the heresy. But really thank you on behalf of the faculty and the Law Journal for such illuminating and wonderful remarks, fitting to launch such a wonderful journal. The second set of thanks are, of course, to KWM for this wonderful venue and for their generosity today, but as Michelle said, actually for the last 35 years in being such a generous and consistent premier sponsor of the journal. KWM is a long-standing friend of the law school generally. As many of you will know, has now not so recently, but in the last couple of years, endowed a chair in international finance, which is occupied by our colleague Ross Buckley. It's a very valued and generous supporter of the law school as well as the Law Journal, and we particularly value their hospitality and their support in this context. And I say that as someone who used to, as a summer clerk and graduate lawyer, be in this room. It really is a delight to be back and see the wonderful things that KWM is doing in relation to sustainability as part of, rethinking the challenge that we all face. The third happy task that I have this evening is to congratulate Andrew and the Executive Committee and all the members of the Editorial Board on such fine work. As someone who writes articles from time to time, I know how important it is for the authors to have such outstanding, hardworking and diligent editors making the articles shine and making them accurate and professional and producing such a wonderful collection. They really have worked incredibly hard, and we congratulate them for the excellent product that they have produced, which is a real contribution to legal and to policy and debate in a global, not just a national sense. All of the other speakers have celebrated the contents of the journal. I mentioned just a couple of things about it. I think it probably is one of the most interdisciplinary editions we've ever seen. It has perspectives that draw on theory, on technology, on science, on notably empirical perspectives in the general edition, and covers topics from domestic violence to fiduciary duties to constitutional law and health law, as well as the amazing thematic articles. I think that it is worth pausing to note that as part of those wonderful articles, there is a real seamless transition between the global and the national, which I think is required for rethinking climate change, but will define scholarship in the future, as well as a notable degree of collaboration between authors. Some of these articles look like science articles. They have 4 or 5 authors to them, and I think that's actually also a wonderfully interesting and part of what has been produced and worthy of celebration. 2 of the book reviews in the general section of the journal review books by colleagues. Ben Golder, who has written an amazing and very well critically received book on Foucault and the politics of rights, which if we read it broadly might give us ways of thinking about the politics of climate change as well, and a book by Gabrielle Appleby on the role of the Solicitor General, which, as you know, has been attracting much interest in the press of late. And as stand-in for the Dean, I wanted to particularly note how wonderful those books are and how well received they've been, and how pleasing it is to see them reviewed so generously and enthusiastically by leaders in the field. Of course, colleagues are also represented in the thematic edition, and Jane McAdam and Bronwyn Morgan and Declan Cush's work in particular stands out in that context. UNSW Faculty of Law and the university generally is very committed to helping rethink climate change. We have some of the leading research in Australia and internationally on the relationship between climate change and refugee and migration policy, and Bronwyn's and Declan's work as part of a broader team on how to create the legal institutions and forms that can help us address these problems from the bottom up. The university, as you may know, also has a range of important initiatives, including a grand challenge on climate change, which is trying to support and promote the very debate that we've seen in this journal and tonight. So let me again say my very sincere thanks to Justice Preston, to KWM and our hosts, and please join me in congratulating the students, Andrew Roberts most notably, but the executive and all the members of the editorial board on a truly terrific general and thematic edition.